I'll never forget the day the doorman called me aside with that hesitant look in his eyes. He seemed to be carrying a secret too heavy for him. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "Your husband has been going up to the neighbor's house frequently." At that moment, my legs shook as if the ground had cracked. The vow of eternal love I'd heard for years echoed in my head like a cruel lie. The scene seemed like something out of a movie, but it was my life. I, a 48-year-old woman dedicated to a 2-decade marriage, was there, being confronted with the greatest wound in my history. Every memory of midnight promises or embraces in the kitchen felt like an insult. The maturity I'd gained over the years prevented me from reacting impulsively. I took a deep breath and let the pain flow from within, not allowing him to realize how much I already knew. The doorman looked away, perhaps regretting having spoken. But the damage was done. At that moment, I decided I wouldn't confront him without clearer evidence. What I needed was silence, observation, and strategy. My heart screamed for answers, but my mind begged me for patience. And it was at that point that my life changed forever, because I was about to enter a game of discovery that no one imagines until they live it. I continued my routine as if nothing had happened. I woke up early, made breakfast, and smiled as always. He kissed me on the forehead before leaving, with that false naturalness that now disgusted me. I observed every detail, from his perfume to his hurried way of leaving. Everything that had once been affection now seemed like a rehearsal. The nights began to get stranger. He said he had to work late, but the messages on his phone always arrived silently. When I asked him something, he deflected with quick answers. I smiled, pretended to believe, but inside I wrote down every detail. My maturity didn't let me scream, it let me investigate. I knew he was hiding something because his routine no longer matched the life we had. That man who used to arrive tired but happy to see me now arrived irritated or, at times, even overly excited. His gaze no longer rested on me. He seemed to live in another reality that I wasn't a part of. One night, he left his smartwatch charging in the living room. I silently checked his step and run log. There were records of walks at times when he claimed to be in the office. It wasn't a coincidence. I took a deep breath and continued because the truth was coming out on its own. On Sunday, I went to the grocery store with him. On the way, his phone vibrated and I caught a glimpse of the neighbor's name. He quickly turned the device face down. I said nothing, just stored that image in my mind. It was another piece of the puzzle falling into place. I began to sense that his body also carried signs. The smell of different soap, as if he'd just come from another bathroom. The sweet perfume of clothes that weren't mine. When I hugged him, I felt that strangeness that made me recoil. I didn't need words. My senses were already screaming the truth. On our wedding anniversary, he hadn't even bought flowers. He'd just brought a box of chocolates and said he didn't have time. I smiled and thanked him, but inside me a huge void grew. How could someone who promised eternal love treat his own wife as an obligation? That was already a silent message. That same day, while doing laundry, I found a receipt from an expensive restaurant. The date didn't match any time we'd been together. I put it in my pocket and said nothing. My heart ached, but my mind sharpened. I knew I was plotting the betrayal. One day, when I got home early from work, I found his car hastily parked. I asked where he was, and he said he was in a meeting. But the engine was still warm, and the position of the seat betrayed that he'd just left. He lied naturally, but I no longer believed anything. I even began to notice the way he dressed. Too much perfume to go to the bakery. Well-ironed shirts to fix things quickly. The care that once seemed to be for me was now for someone else. I swallowed hard, held my ground, but every detail was like a silent knife in my chest. He started avoiding some family dinners, always with excuses about work or emergency meetings. I went alone, smiling so as not to arouse suspicion, but inside I felt the weight of humiliation. It was as if I were already living two lives, that of a wife in public and that of a detective in silence. One day, I summoned the courage to ask directly, "Do you have something to tell me?" He smirked, kissed my forehead, and said, "You're imagining things, love." His statement was like a punch. Pure gaslighting. He wanted to make me believe my intuition was crazy. That night, I cried alone in the bathroom. The tears were not just of pain, but of anger. I looked in the mirror and saw a strong woman who didn't deserve to be deceived. It was then that I promised myself I would no longer accept cheap excuses. I would go all the way, no matter what. I began to develop a routine of observation. I noted the times he left, the excuses he used, the objects he brought with him. Everything became evidence. It wasn't just intuition, it was method. I was becoming someone I never thought I'd be, an investigator of my own life. He noticed nothing. He continued with the arrogance of someone who believes he's too smart. Perhaps he thought I was too busy with work and home. What he didn't know was that his every move was being recorded. The game had changed, and he didn't even suspect it. At work, colleagues would comment on his leaving early. When they asked, I smiled and said it was normal. But deep down, each comment was like a push forward. I was about to put the pieces together and show he wasn't the man everyone believed. One afternoon, I noticed he'd received a call and ran to answer it in the hallway. He spoke softly, using short words, as if trying to avoid being overheard. When he returned, he smiled as if nothing had happened. That act no longer fooled me. I was ready to unmask him. I began to set little traps. I left questions hanging just to watch his reaction. Every time he lied, his body betrayed me. His eyes would shift, his hands would sweat, his tone would change. He didn't notice, but I saw it all. My calm was what confused him. At my sister's birthday party, he said he was tired and wouldn't be going. Later, while we were taking family photos, I received a notification on my phone. His car had been spotted near the neighbor's address. My chest felt cold. Confirmation was getting closer. I kept this information to myself without saying anything. I wanted him to believe I was in control. Meanwhile, I prepared my groundwork. It was only a matter of time before the truth exploded before everyone's eyes. He no longer kissed me with the same desire. His touch was mechanical, emotionless. I felt the physical distance like a wall between us. The marriage that had once been a refuge was now just a facade. I lived next door to a stranger who disguised himself as my husband. One night, he left his cell phone on the table and went to take a shower. The screen lit up, and I saw a notification. "I'm already waiting for you." The neighbor's name appeared for seconds. My heart raced, but I took a deep breath and didn't move. I needed more. I needed the exact moment. I wasn't sleeping well anymore. Each night felt like waiting. Hearing the key turn in the door became a test of my patience. Kai watched him enter and pretended to be calm. But inside, I counted the minutes until his mistake became irreversible. I started paying attention to the doorman. He always hesitated when talking about schedules. One day, he accidentally blurted out, "He's already up this morning." My stomach churned, but I just smiled. I was already certain. All that was missing was the final glimpse. That day, I put on my simplest clothes, as if expecting nothing. He left, saying he was going to take care of some work. I went downstairs and stayed in the car, watching. A short time later, I saw his car park in front of the neighbor's building. My heart raced. I saw him ring the intercom and smile like he hadn't smiled at me in months. The door opened, and he walked in without hesitation. It was the final blow. The scene I needed to never believe any excuses again. I stood there, motionless, feeling the world crumble and rebuild itself at the same time. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just let reality engrave itself on me like an eternal tattoo. There, I knew my marriage was over. The silence of that moment was louder than any argument. I didn't need to fight. I had the truth before my eyes. The weight of the lie finally turned into certainty. While he laughed inside, I breathed deeply outside. Every second of that wait felt like an eternity. And it was in that instant that I understood. My life would never be the same. He believed he was in control, but I was already one step ahead. With every detail he hid, I gained strength. His betrayal wouldn't just be a pain, it would be the key to my liberation. Now, the decision was in my hands. The moment to turn the tables was getting closer. I just needed to choose how and when to show him that nothing would go unnoticed. And that's when I realized his downfall wouldn't just be in my heart, but in the eyes of everyone who believed his lies. I woke up to the alarm clock and realized he was no longer by my side, something that had become frequent. I performed my morning ritual in silence, controlling the tremors in my hands, and continued my routine as if everything were normal. On my way to work, I saw his car slowly driving down the street in front of the neighbor's building. My heart raced, but I remained calm, recording that moment as further proof that my suspicions were correct. Throughout the day, I received affectionate messages, but they sounded rehearsed, cold, and devoid of real emotion. I wrote down the times and details, no longer seeing them as displays of affection, but rather as part of a poorly staged performance. At lunch, a colleague mentioned that she had seen my husband entering the neighbor's building on a few occasions. She said it without malice, simply sharing what she'd heard in the building. And it confirmed that what I was experiencing wasn't a figment of my imagination. That afternoon, he called me saying he'd be stuck in a meeting until late. I asked for a photo to confirm, and the silence on the other end was answer enough. When I hung up, I realized he was trying to manipulate me once again. When I got home, I noticed a towel with a sweet scent that wasn't mine. I put the item in a plastic bag as if it were proof. It wasn't paranoia, it was fact. On Saturday, I went out to the market and saw him talking to a woman I didn't know, smiling in a way I no longer reserved for myself. I held the scene as if it were a mental photograph and returned home feigning normalcy. I made a simple dinner and he arrived late, automatically kissing me on the forehead. My body reacted with revulsion, but I learned to hide it. He was no longer my husband, he was a stranger playing a role. In the following days, I noticed he changed clothes in a hurry, leaving traces of his clothes in the closet. I began discreetly photographing suspicious details and objects. At that point, I no longer allowed myself to cry. I was collecting evidence. One night, I heard a muffled chuckle coming from his cell phone while he slept. I recognized the sound. It was intimate. I feigned sleep and didn't touch the device, but I realized the situation was out of control. On Sunday, I found a store tag in the pocket of a new shirt. I saved the store name and the date. I realized these weren't just casual encounters. There was planning, gifts, and care to maintain another life. I also received an old audio message from him in the family group and felt disgusted. The same voice that spoke affectionate words was the same one that deceived me every day. I deleted the file immediately, like someone who expels something toxic from the house. I started chatting with the doorman whenever I could. Without realizing it, he would let slip important information about my husband's arrival and departure times. One day, I saw a preview of a message on his phone, which included the address and time. I mentally captured it before it disappeared. His technology became my greatest ally. At social events, he began refusing to take photos with me, always with vague excuses. It was humiliating. I felt my anger rising, but I used the energy to reinforce my strategy. I took a day off and organized old photos, receipts, and notes from our wedding. I created a timeline and realized the lie hadn't arisen out of nowhere, but from small concessions accumulated over the years. I also found an empty gift box in the trunk of his car, a sign he was investing time and effort in someone else. With each discovery, the happy past seemed more distant. At a dinner with friends, he spoke casually about future plans, and I realized it was all just an act. I no longer wanted the past back, I wanted justice. I put together a digital dossier with screenshots, receipts, and archived messages. Saved file was a step toward regaining control of my life. In one of his pants, I found an intimate note, written clearly to him, without any room for doubt. That was like the final proof. He believed he was hiding it well, but the tracks were obvious. I discreetly spoke with a lawyer friend to understand how to protect evidence. Knowing I had legal backing gave me even more strength. At his company party, I noticed glances between him and a colleague. They weren't friendly, they were complicit. My perception never faltered. I simply confirmed what was already certain. I planned how to expose the truth without portraying myself as a helpless victim. I wanted him to fall by his own actions, with no chance of changing the narrative. Even when he tried to be affectionate, I saw it was just a cover. One rainy morning, I found an old hotel receipt in his jacket pocket. The date coincided with the day he claimed to be working. A few nights later, I followed him in his car again and saw him entering another building. I recorded the time and place without hesitation. I shared subtle signs with close friends who confirmed they had also noticed changes in his behavior. I wasn't alone in this interpretation. With each conversation, the network of indirect witnesses grew. I organized the evidence in chronological order and wrote a detailed account for myself. Describing the facts helped me maintain my sanity, without letting emotion distort my memory. As I sat alone in my room that night, I looked around and realized that pain was no longer the center of my life. Now, the decision was. The confrontation was getting closer, and I knew it would be final. What I carried was no longer just hurt, but an arsenal of certainties. From that moment on, I would no longer live as a victim, but as the protagonist of a choice that would change everything. And it was at that point that I understood this wasn't just about catching someone cheating, but about rewriting my own story once and for all. With each day, my ability to observe grew more refined. I was no longer just a wife. I was someone who closely studied behavior. I noticed that he was always using his cell phone with his back to me, as if afraid of the reflection on the screen. His care only increased my certainty that something was wrong. Trust had turned into silent vigilance. One night, while he was showering, I heard his phone vibrate on the living room table. It was a calendar notification, but the name that appeared was Neighbor's Dinner. Shock coursed through me. I didn't open anything, just mentally registered it. This kind of detail showed me that he no longer bothered to hide it cleverly. I started noticing the doorman whenever I passed by the building. His previously neutral gaze now betrayed a certain unease, as if he knew more than he'd like. One afternoon, while signing for a package, he blurted out, "Your husband was here earlier today." I stood still for a few seconds, but responded with only a restrained smile. Inside, it was as if the world had given me the final confirmation. His body also gave signals. He'd come home with subtle marks of light lipstick on the collar of his shirt. A sweet scent of feminine perfume clung to his clothes. He made excuses about hugging coworkers, but I no longer listened. Every detail became silent ammunition. The excuses became repetitive. Meetings that didn't exist, unverified trips, vague commitments. He didn't realize I was silently checking everything. I called the company during one of these trips and discovered there was nothing scheduled. He believed he was in control, but the lie was already too obvious. I also noticed that, at social events, he avoided holding my hand. He sat in separate chairs or constantly stared at his phone. People noticed, but no one spoke directly. The silence of others only reinforced the loneliness I experienced even with him. It was like living with a stranger masquerading as a husband. The situation became unbearable. My relatives asked about him, and I made excuses. I felt ashamed of covering for a man who didn't deserve it. He made me carry the burden of maintaining the image of a perfect marriage alone. And each lie I repeated was another cut in my own heart. One day, I decided to follow him without him knowing. I waited for him to leave for a supposed meeting, and, minutes later, I followed. I kept my distance, watching carefully. He entered the neighbor's building without even looking around. The scene was as clear as a punch. There was no longer room for doubt. I returned home in silence, sat on the sofa, and stared at the walls. The betrayal was no longer just a suspicion. It was a certainty etched before my eyes. I cried softly, but the pain soon transformed into something else. It was no longer suffering, it was determination. I needed more. I needed to plan how I would expose everything. In the following days, I began storing evidence in a hidden folder. Screenshots of messages, photos of schedules, receipts from places he claimed not to frequent. It was as if I were writing a story that would one day need to be told. Each page of this dossier was a piece of my restored dignity. His calmness irritated me. He would come home smiling, talking about future plans, as if nothing had happened. The most painful thing was realizing how naturally he lied. There was no hesitation, no weight in his voice. It was as if he truly believed I would never find out. One night, I sat at the table with him and asked, "Are you happy with us?" He looked me in the eye and replied firmly, "Of course, you mean everything to me." As he spoke, his cell phone vibrated in his hand with the neighbor's name appearing on the screen. The contrast was so stark that I had to hide it so I wouldn't break down right there. I began to dream of confrontations. I saw myself entering the neighbor's apartment, exposing everything in front of her. I imagined how he would react, how he would deny it until the last second. But I would wake up and remember, it wasn't time yet. I needed calm to land the right blow. One rainy afternoon, I found a hotel parking receipt in his pants pocket. The date coincided with the day he said he'd stayed late at work. I held the paper for several seconds, feeling the chill of betrayal course through my body. That was more than proof, it was a verdict. At the office, a colleague casually commented, "I saw your husband rushing out the other day. He seemed excited." I said nothing, just smiled. But that sentence echoed in my mind. Everyone was already noticing changes. I was the only one who continued to maintain an image of normalcy. And this realization began to bother me more than the betrayal itself. I began to notice that he changed his cell phone password frequently. It was as if he was afraid I'd catch on. But I forgot that actions said much more than any message. The body speaks, and his was already screaming. I simply listened in silence. One night, I sat alone in my room and began writing in a notebook. I described every detail, every hour, every clue. Writing was like expelling a poison coursing through me. The diary became a silent witness to my story, ready to be used at the right moment. The nights grew longer and longer. I watched him sleep peacefully while my mind whirled with plans. What had once been love was now calculation. And every time he smiled upon waking, I felt like that smile hadn't been mine for a long time. It was borrowed from someone else. I realized my pain wasn't just about him anymore, but about me. I wondered why I was letting it last so long. The answer came quickly. I wanted justice, not just a separation. I wanted him to feel the weight of the lie revealed, not to emerge unscathed. One morning, I decided to test his excuses. I asked about a trip he'd mentioned. He didn't remember the details. He'd made them up quickly, stumbling over his own words. I felt a cruel relief as the mask slipped for seconds. I was getting closer and closer to seeing it completely fall. He tried to surprise me with flowers a few days later. He placed them on the table and said he missed me. I looked at those flowers and saw only guilt. I didn't thank him with all my heart, I just shook my head. It wasn't love, it was an act. And I was no longer participating in this act. People around me began to notice my distance. Friends commented that I was colder, more serious. They didn't know I was carrying on a silent war within myself. I just smiled and said I was tired, when in reality I was just on high alert. My body began to react to the tension. Insomnia, lack of appetite, chest pain. But at the same time, an inner strength grew. I was no longer the same woman who believed everything. Now I knew I could no longer back down. The truth was in my hands. That Sunday, as he dozed on the couch, I stared at his face. It was strange to watch someone I knew so well and realize there was nothing real there anymore. The man I loved was hiding behind a mask of lies, and that mask was about to fall. I stored all the evidence in a secret folder on my computer. I password protected it and hid copies in a cloud. It was no longer just instinct, it was strategy. If he tried to change the story, I had everything prepared. And that gave me a sense of power I'd never felt before. That night, lying beside him, I decided I was ready. Not for the immediate confrontation, but for the final step of my investigation. His downfall wouldn't come from shouting, but from certainty. And when that certainty was exposed, nothing could be erased. I didn't just want to survive the betrayal. I wanted it to be seen by those who had always believed his words. This wasn't about cheap revenge, but about justice. It was my dignity being rebuilt with every detail preserved. And it was in this state of absolute coldness that I realized the next test wouldn't be just a detail. It would be the final blow that would forever change how he and everyone around me would see me. I knew the pieces were already there, but the final fitting was still missing. Every day my husband handed me more proof without realizing it. Silence became my ally and calm my armor. He believed he deceived me easily, but in truth he was sinking alone. It was like watching someone dig their own hole. One afternoon, I noticed he'd changed his phone password again. He pretended it was because of a security issue at work, but I knew the truth. I didn't need access to the device. His behavior said it all. Avoiding my gaze when I asked was his go-to response. And this evasion was so obvious it became ridiculous. At dinner I noticed he tried to bring up trivial topics, as if nothing were happening. He talked about sports, about news he'd read online, but he couldn't maintain a naturalness. His nervous look, his rush to finish his meal, betrayed his anxiety. I ate slowly, analyzing every gesture. It was becoming increasingly clear. He couldn't pretend with me anymore. At work, the excuses continued. He'd say he was going out to external meetings, but colleagues would comment that they'd seen him in random places. No one suspected the gravity of it, but the comments fed me confirmation. It was impossible to hide everything in such a public life. Lies have short legs, and he was tired of running. A friend called me in private. She said she didn't want to get involved, but she'd seen my husband entering the neighbor's building at different times. Her concern was almost painful to hear. Confirmation from another mouth made me feel anger and relief at the same time. I thanked him, keeping my expression calm, but inside me the war intensified. That night, I waited for him to arrive and observed the false fatigue on his face. The dark circles weren't from work, but from nights divided between two lives. With every hug he gave, I felt the weight of guilt clinging to him. The body doesn't lie, and his was already overflowing with evidence. I just closed my eyes and took a deep breath. I decided to try a simple trap. I asked about a time I knew he was with his neighbor. He got mixed up, inventing a last-minute meeting with colleagues. The thing is, those colleagues were with me at the same time. I smiled inwardly, knowing the circle was closing in. He didn't realize how fragile his lies were. One day, I found a forgotten voicemail on the tablet he sometimes used. It was short but clear. The neighbor saying, "I miss you already." The recording froze my entire body. It was the living proof I needed. I kept it silent, without showing that I had discovered it. Now, her words were also in my collection of evidence. The doorman began to look at me differently, as if he wanted to say something but didn't have the courage. One rainy day, he finally blurted out he was here almost every afternoon last week. I just shook my head as if it were irrelevant information. But that sentence was the definitive seal on everything I already knew. It was impossible to deny it in the face of so many confirmations. Meanwhile, at home, he tried to make up for it with small gestures. He bought chocolates, brought flowers, complimented the food. But I no longer saw affection there, only disguised guilt. It was as if he were trying to buy my silence, unaware that I already had everything recorded. The gesture that once brought me joy now only provoked contempt. The nights grew increasingly tense. I pretended to sleep, while he slipped out to answer calls. The light from the screen illuminated the dark room, and I watched with half-closed eyes. Each muffled word was another brick in the wall of lies. The room that was once our sanctuary became a stage for secrets. Over the weekend, he said he needed to work on an important report. I decided to follow him again, calmly and at a distance. I watched as he parked his car and entered his neighbor's building as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He didn't hesitate, didn't look back. His confidence in his own deception infuriated me even more. I returned home without saying anything, but I prepared a folder with photos and documents in chronological order. Each entry was a piece of the puzzle that told the story of the betrayal. I knew I needed to be ready for the moment of confrontation, and that day, I felt I was almost there. Conversations with my friends began to change in tone. I let out small signs and realized they understood without me having to explain. The complicit silence of women who had been through this strengthened me. I wasn't alone, many knew, they just didn't speak. This silent network gave me even more courage. My body reacted to the tension. I had sleepless nights, lack of appetite, and constant headaches. But along with the symptoms, an inner strength I hadn't recognized was growing. It was as if the pain was sharpening my resolve. I no longer wanted just to survive. I wanted justice. That week, I decided to observe how he would react if I became colder. I reduced my closeness, my hugs, and my conversations. He noticed, tried to get closer, but the coldness made him uncomfortable. His reaction was enough for me to realize something was falling apart. He already felt he no longer had control over me. One Sunday, while tidying up my closet, I found a hidden gift box. It was empty, but the feminine ribbon was still attached. It was the missing material proof. I held that box for a few seconds and felt my anger rise like fire. I put it away without saying anything, another piece from the collection. My neighbor started passing me in the hallway. Her gaze always averted, her pace quickened. Her posture betrayed more than words. It was as if her very presence was silently apologizing. This attitude confirmed the weight of our shared guilt. One evening, I sat on the couch and turned on the TV. He approached with forced ease, trying to make conversation. But I no longer listened to the words, just studied the tone of his voice. It was strange to realize I knew the signs of lying more than anything else. Life with him had become a constant analysis. I decided I wouldn't let this continue indefinitely. I didn't want to destroy myself in silence. I mentally planned the right moment to expose everything. I knew it wouldn't be with shouting or empty arguments. It would be with proof, with dignity, with firmness. And that gave me a cold peace. At social events, I noticed he was becoming increasingly restless. He avoided physical contact, making excuses to stay away. I just observed, recording every detail. People were starting to notice something was wrong, but no one dared ask directly. His showmanship was losing its power. At work, his behavior repeated itself. Distracted, disconnected, always looking at his phone. Even colleagues began to notice, commenting casually. For me, each comment was another confirmation. He could no longer hide it, not even in the environment where he spent most of his time. I began to think about how to expose the truth so no one could deny it. I knew it needed to be at the right moment, when he was most certain nothing would be discovered. The fall would be greater, and I wanted it to be definitive. Not just for him, but for everyone who believed in the false image. The days passed, and my silence became even more deafening. I no longer cried, no longer begged for explanations. I simply observed, recorded, and strengthened myself. And this attitude left him even more lost. He didn't understand where he had lost control. One night, lying in bed, I realized there was no more pain. What existed now was pure determination. He slept beside me, peacefully, unaware that his charade was about to end. I looked at him for long seconds and felt nothing. Neither love nor hate, just the coldness of someone who already knew what needed to be done. I got up, went to my computer, and organized the evidence for the last time. The dossier was complete, untouchable, impossible to deny. I looked at the screen and felt a weight lift from my shoulders. I was ready. The game was over for him, even if he didn't know it yet. And it was in that moment of absolute silence that I understood the next step wouldn't just be about betrayal, but about who I would become after exposing the whole truth. The next morning, I woke determined to observe his every move even more calmly. I made coffee, set the table, and waited. He arrived, already dressed too neatly for a regular meeting. His perfume was strong, unusual, as if he'd been chosen to impress. I sat at the table and simply watched without question. He spoke about the day's commitments, but his haste betrayed his nervousness. He constantly fiddled with his phone, glancing at the screen and turning his back. I remained silent, sipping my coffee slowly. The simple act of observing him became an internal battleground. With each gesture, I saw the lie more clearly. That afternoon, I decided to call the company where he claimed to be. The secretary, unaware, confirmed that there was no meeting scheduled. Anger rose within me like wildfire, but I managed to maintain a neutral tone. I hung up the phone and wrote down the information. It was another piece in the dossier that grew by the day. That night, when he got home, I asked how the meeting had gone. He answered quickly, without details, making up names and situations, smiled as if believing, but inside I registered the scene. The improvisation was so poorly executed that it almost made me want to laugh. He didn't realize he'd already lost control. On the weekend, the routine also became a test. He would invent last-minute commitments and leave the house without inviting me. I just watched. The hours he disappeared were exactly the same as those recorded in the Uber history I was able to access. It was impressive how technology left no trace. On Sunday, I sat next to him on the couch and tried to strike up a light conversation. I talked about family, about friends, children, but he was distant. His body was present, his mind far away. Every time he looked away, I understood that the connection between us was gone. It was like living with a living ghost. I also began to notice the physical signs of wear and tear. He was thinner, more restless, and had dark circles under his eyes. It was the weight of leading two lives at once. And no matter how hard he tried to hide it, I knew every detail about him. It was clear that the charade was eroding his own health. One night, I heard muffled laughter coming from his cell phone while he was in the bathroom. I approached the door and stood still, listening in silence. The sound was intimate, familiar, but not meant for me. I took a deep breath and returned to the living room, keeping my face impassive. There was no longer any shock, only recognition. At work, a colleague commented that he seemed more animated than usual. Too much so, she said, laughing. It ate away at me inside, but it also confirmed that he was no longer trying to hide it. The double life was spilling out, and everyone was starting to notice. I just absorbed it in silence. One afternoon I was surprised by the doorman again. He commented without thinking, "Your husband stopped by again, midweek." The remark hit me like a punch, but I covered it with a polite smile. Inside I made a mental note and felt my anger rise. The doorman, unknowingly, was becoming one of my main witnesses. I decided to reinforce my strategy. I organized all the screenshots, receipts, and recordings in a physical folder. Every detail was dated, numbered, and ordered. I knew that when the time came, there would be no way he could deny anything. This preparation became my way of remaining calm in the face of the lie. He noticed my change in behavior. He tried to please me with simple gestures, making coffee, complimenting my clothes, asking about my day, but I no longer reacted the same way. He sensed something was different, but he couldn't put his finger on it. This silent fear made him even more vulnerable. One night, I sat down to dinner with him and asked about future plans. He talked about trips, projects, dreams. But as he spoke, his phone vibrated with messages after messages. The neighbor's name flashed on the screen like a cruel reminder. I pretended not to see, but the scene was etched in my memory. The next day, I decided to go to the neighbor's building at a time I knew he would be there. I parked far away and watched. When I saw him enter smiling, a cold rage coursed through me. The certainty before my eyes was unbearable. I took a deep breath and recorded the scene with my phone. I walked home in silence, sat on the couch, and stared into space. There was no longer room for doubt or hope. The betrayal wasn't just suspected, it was reality. And this reality was transforming me into someone I never thought I would be, a woman capable of facing anything with coolness. That night, he arrived and tried to hug me. I recoiled slightly, but without attracting attention. It was enough for him to notice the distance. He looked at me strangely but said nothing. Perhaps he sensed something was wrong, but he didn't dare ask. His fear began to show. I decided not to rush. I continued acting normally, preparing the house, going to work, taking care of the routine, but inside me, the countdown had already begun. The confrontation was getting closer and closer, and he had no idea I was in control. I also began to notice how he behaved around the neighbors. He avoided contact with me when we were in the hallway. His gaze always shifted away, as if he were afraid of being unmasked. This behavior only reinforced my certainty that the mask was about to slip. At family gatherings, his absence began to draw attention. I made excuses, but I felt the suspicious looks. Some already sensed something was wrong, but no one commented directly. It was painful to maintain a lie that wasn't mine. But I knew it would soon all come to light. One morning, I noticed he'd put more effort into his appearance. New shirt, neat hair, expensive perfume. He said he was going to a meeting, but I no longer believed anything. The image of him in the mirror was of someone who lived to impress someone else, and that detail gnawed at me. I spent the entire day thinking about what the confrontation would be like. I imagined the scene, the reactions, the words, but I decided I wouldn't let emotion overwhelm me. I wanted it to be cold, calculated, impossible to refute. This certainty gave me strength. He continued to act as if he were in control. But with every gesture, every word, it was he himself who gave me the proof. The carelessness was becoming routine, and I just waited for the right moment to use it all against him. The silence between us began to become unbearable. Sometimes we would spend hours in the same house without exchanging a meaningful word. It was as if we were two strangers sharing a space. This distance was painful, but also necessary. I needed to stay focused. The nights were the worst. I would toss and turn, pretending to sleep while he went off to answer messages. The reflection of the screen illuminated the room and betrayed his guilt. Each exit was a silent stab, and I let the scene repeat itself, waiting for the right moment. I decided the next step would be definitive. I no longer wanted just isolated evidence. I wanted something caught in the act, something that would end all doubts, something impossible to deny. This thought began to haunt me day and night. He, without realizing it, accelerated this process. Every time he smiled while looking at his phone, every time he made up a poorly crafted excuse, he pushed me closer to the final decision. I just needed to be ready for the right moment. Betrayal was no longer the center of my pain. Now, preparation occupied my mind. I was growing stronger with every detail I kept, with every lie unmasked. And this strength, silent and cold, would be the weapon that would change everything. It was in this state of absolute calm that I understood. The next time I saw him entering that building, I wouldn't just watch. It would be the beginning of the downfall he never imagined he would face. The next morning, I woke up determined to observe his every move even more closely. I made coffee, set the table, and waited. He appeared overdressed for a simple meeting, wearing a strong, unusual perfume, clearly chosen to impress. As he talked about the day's commitments, I noticed the rush in his voice and the way he was fiddling with his phone with his back turned. I sipped my coffee slowly, taking in every detail as if I were making a silent confession. During the afternoon, I called the company where he said he had a meeting, and the secretary, without realizing it, confirmed there was nothing scheduled. I remained calm, hung up, and wrote down the information. That evening, I asked how the meeting had gone, and he made up names and situations, unaware of how improvised it sounded. I smiled on the outside, but inside, I registered the scene, certain that his lie was becoming unsustainable. On weekends, his routine also changed. He would make up sudden commitments and leave without inviting me, always at the same times. I checked his Uber history and found the exact trips that coincided with the periods he'd been missing. The pattern was impossible to deny. On Sunday, I tried to talk to him about family, friends, children, and old memories, but he was distant, present only in body. I felt the connection had completely disappeared. I noticed his body beginning to suffer the effects of leading two lives. He was thinner, darker under his eyes, and restless. He tried to hide it, but I recognized every feature and knew it wasn't work fatigue. One night I heard muffled laughter coming from the bathroom while he was using his cell phone. I recognized the intimacy in his tone and took a deep breath to keep from exploding. I returned to the living room feigning normalcy, but the scene stuck in my mind. Coworkers commented that he seemed overly cheerful lately, which gnawed at me, but also confirmed what I already knew. The doorman inadvertently reinforced my suspicions, dropping hints about his visits during the week. At home, the gestures of affection increased, like chocolates and flowers, but for me they were no longer displays of love, just disguised guilt. He believed he was deceiving me, when in reality, each attempt only reinforced the truth. The nights became more tense. Pretending to sleep, I watched him sneak out to answer calls and texts, illuminated by the screen of his cell phone in the dark of the room. It was painful to see the space that was once our refuge become a stage for secrets. One Saturday, I followed him again and saw him park in front of the neighbor's building. He entered smiling, confident, unaware that he was being watched. I returned home with a heavy heart, but strengthened by the irrefutable proof. That night, he tried to hug me, but I recoiled slightly. The gesture was small, but enough for him to sense my coldness. He didn't ask anything, perhaps afraid of the answer. I continued my normal routine, but deep down I knew the countdown to confrontation had begun. At family gatherings, his absence was increasingly noticeable. I made excuses, but the shame of maintaining that charade hurt me deeply. I began to analyze his behavior down to the smallest detail. He avoided contact with me in the hallways of the building, averting his gaze, as if afraid of being unmasked. At social events, he seemed restless, unable to maintain his naturalness. The silence between us became an abyss, and sometimes we spent hours in the same house without exchanging real words. Our life together had become a life of strangers. The nights were the worst. Pretending to sleep, I felt the silent stab every time he got out of bed to answer his cell phone. I decided I needed a definitive flagrant, something that would put an end to all doubts. I no longer wanted just loose evidence. I wanted something impossible to deny. With every smile he gave as he glanced at his phone, with every poorly crafted excuse, I understood the moment was near. It was no longer pain that drove me, but preparation. With every detail kept hidden, with every lie exposed, I grew stronger. My coldness became the weapon that would change everything. And it was in this state of absolute calm that I realized, the next time he entered that building, I wouldn't just watch, it would be the beginning of a downfall he'd never imagined he'd face. I woke up with a clear plan in mind, feeling that day would carry a different weight. I left the house as usual, but with my eyes alert to every detail. At work, I thought of 1,000 ways to reveal the truth, but I remained calm, knowing that each step needed to be calculated. During lunch, a friend texted me saying she'd seen my husband with another woman. I took a deep breath, not to deny it, but to confirm that it wasn't just a suspicion. Later, I discreetly chatted with an acquaintance who lived near the neighbor. I brought up the subject lightly, and she, without realizing it, confirmed the dates and times I'd already recorded. It was another piece to the puzzle I'd been putting together. When I returned home, I noticed his car in the parking lot, the seat still warm. I glanced at my watch and realized that once again, the excuses didn't match reality. That night, he spoke casually about weekend plans, but his expression told me otherwise. I listened to him without interrupting, pretending to believe him. In those days, I organized all the evidence in order: screenshots, receipts, recordings, every detail saved in backups. He, without realizing it, helped me with every false step he took. With each new lie, the certainty that I needed a definitive catch grew. His routine began to show signs that he was trying to better cover his tracks. He used different routes, took longer to respond, but the digital traces didn't lie. The more he tried to disguise himself, the clearer it became that he was lost. I knew I needed a clear moment to expose everything, and I decided it would be in public, in front of people who had always believed in him. It wasn't about humiliation, but about revealing the truth without any chance of denial. I organized a dinner, inviting mutual friends and family, pretending it was just a normal get-together. I calmly tidied the house, every detail ready as if it were a normal evening. When he arrived, I noticed the confidence in his smile and posture. The guests were chatting distractedly, unaware of what was about to happen. I waited for the right moment and began speaking, my voice firm and calm. I explained times, dates, showed excerpts of messages, evidence that left no room for interpretation. The reactions were immediate: silence, heavy gazes, and a tension that gripped the room. He tried to deny it, laugh, then resorted to work-related excuses, but the evidence was too clear. The looks in everyone's eyes were no longer of trust but of doubt. The mask he'd worn for months began to slip before everyone. Some tried to change the subject or plead for calm, but the mood had already shifted. The truth, stated simply and directly, carried a weight no one could ignore. He stuttered, fumbling with his words while I remained firm. I didn't need to shout, I didn't need to dramatize. The facts spoke for themselves. And in that moment, the scales tipped. After dinner, some came to support me discreetly. Others walked away silently. Some confessed they'd always suspected, but never said anything. I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. The truth liberates, but it also isolates. In the following days, I realized the environment around me was no longer the same. People looked at me differently, some with respect, others with judgment. I, however, felt I had regained something more valuable than other people's approval: my dignity. He tried to retell the story in other circles, making excuses and minimizing what happened. But the contradictions became clear, and his version didn't hold up. The more he tried to defend himself, the deeper he sank. I remained silent, focused on organizing my practical life. I sought out my lawyer, formalized documents, and began to solidly plan my independence. Social reactions were mixed. Some openly supported me, others avoided contact. Over time, I learned to choose who to trust and to value the few who remained. At home, I reorganized the spaces, changed small details, letting the environment reflect my new phase. The void he left was filled with a strange sense of freedom. There were still difficult moments, memories that returned and tried to weaken me. But I learned to deal with them without losing myself. I replaced sleepless nights with walks, conversations with friends, and personal projects that had previously been put on hold. Little by little, I regained my rhythm, my breath, and my voice. And with that, I realized that his fall was just the beginning of my reconstruction. The process wasn't easy, but it was real. The judgment of others, the changes in routine, the painful memories, it was all part of the journey. But in the end, the certainty that remained was that I was no longer trapped in a lie. I had recovered myself, and it was at that point that I understood the greatest victory wasn't his exposure, but the recovery of my voice and my life. The days after dinner were filled with tension and silence. He left the house earlier than usual, avoiding my gaze, and returned late that night without any convincing explanation. I no longer had any interest in excuses because nothing I said would change the facts. The calm I maintained in front of everyone remained, but deep down I already knew I was preparing for the final stage. Socializing became only a temporary arrangement. At work, I noticed colleagues began to look at me differently. Some approached me affectionately, others avoided contact, as if afraid of getting involved. I handled it with the same serenity I had adopted at home. I didn't seek anyone's approval, I just wanted clarity. The betrayal, now public, wasn't just about me anymore. It was about how each person reacted to the truth. He tried to keep up appearances, but he no longer had the same confidence. He spent more time on his phone, as if looking for ways to control the narrative. I watched from afar, knowing that the more he talked, the more he contradicted himself. Mutual friends began to comment on the different versions he was spreading. This only reinforced the image of a man in decline. At home, the coldness deepened. Meals were eaten in silence, each on their own side of the table. The tense atmosphere was so heavy that even the objects seemed to reflect the wear and tear. I no longer felt pain, only the strange tranquility of knowing the decision has been made. Living together became an empty formality. One night he tried to talk to me about starting over, saying there was still a chance to rebuild trust. I listened silently, without interrupting. Deep down, I knew those words were nothing more than desperation, because guilt was keeping him awake. The difference was that I no longer wanted anything from there. The broken trust couldn't be repaired. As he spoke, I remembered every piece of evidence I'd saved, every night of anguish when I'd had to feign calm. The distance between us was already greater than any attempt at rapprochement. I realized there was no longer room for dialogue, only for practical decisions. The marriage had become a bankrupt company struggling to survive losses. I didn't want to invest any more energy in something that was already lost. I began discreetly organizing important documents, joint accounts, passwords, contracts. I saved copies and moved them to a safe place without his knowledge. With each step, I felt I was regaining control of my life. The fear that had previously paralyzed me now gave way to confidence. I was no longer a hostage to lies. The neighborhood, of course, was talking. Some greeted me with compassionate looks, others crossed the street to avoid conversations. This reaction taught me to recognize who truly cared. True friends showed up without needing an invitation. They were there, present, offering discreet support. This was essential to keeping me from feeling alone. He, on the other hand, seemed increasingly cornered. He avoided parties, avoided long conversations, and the confident expression he once carried faded. His eyes no longer held anyone's. It was like watching an actor who lost the script mid-scene. And I watched it all with the coolness of someone who had already understood the end of the story. I began to take care of myself in a new way. I returned to activities I had abandoned. Night walks, long readings, recipes I'd always wanted to try. The silence in the house was no longer heavy. It was beginning to feel liberating. His absence from my choices was an achievement, no longer a void. And that gave me strength for the next steps. He still tried to control small details like schedules and questions about where I was going. But these attempts felt pathetic because he no longer had power over me. I responded calmly, without justifying myself, only providing information when necessary. The role reversal was clear. He, once confident, was now the suspicious one. I, once cornered, was the one in control. At a dinner with friends, I told them I was ready to call it quits. They listened attentively, without judging, only supporting. It was the first time I had verbalized my decision without feeling afraid. The words came naturally, as if they were already written within me. There, I realized there was no turning back. With each passing day, indifference replaced pain. I no longer felt anger, only certainty. The betrayal had transformed me into someone stronger, less naive. What had once been a wound was now a scar, and scars no longer hurt, they only remind me. This clarity was the weapon I needed to make the final decision. He started leaving the house more frequently, but now without confidence. He'd return suspiciously, looking at me as if waiting for a reaction. I just watched, without asking anything. The silence gnawed at him because he no longer knew what I knew. His insecurity was proof he was already defeated. At work, a few people approached me to ask how I was doing. I responded calmly, without going into details. I realized that my strength lay precisely in not having to justify myself. I no longer owed anyone explanations. This control over my narrative gave me a sense of power I'd never felt before. At home, he still tried to provoke conversations about the future, but I didn't engage. I responded with short, emotionless sentences. The barrier between us was insurmountable. There was no longer a couple, just two people sharing a temporary roof. And this gave me even greater clarity that it was time to call it quits. I began to plan my exit calmly. I analyzed financial possibilities, new spaces, and even discreetly spoke with a real estate agent. Each step was a rehearsal for freedom. The more I planned, the lighter I felt. His weight was no longer on me. He, unknowingly, was destroying himself. Attempts to contact friends diminished, invitations became rare. His image was tarnished and beyond repair. The double life had taken its toll. I simply watched him fall without needing to push. I began to take pleasure in small daily victories. Tidying the house to my liking, choosing plans on my own, even the silence at dinner took on a new meaning. It was the sound of my independence emerging. Every simple gesture was an affirmation that I no longer needed him. The nights were no longer sleepless. I slept peacefully, knowing I no longer carried the weight of doubt. All that remained was the transition to the new. He was still by my side, but he was already just a physical presence. The bond had been severed long before. The friends who remained close were essential. Long conversations, practical advice, and, above all, listening. I realized I didn't need a crowd, but a few true people. This was essential to maintaining sanity amidst the chaos. He still tried to change the narrative, saying I had changed, that I was distant. I smiled wryly inside, knowing change was inevitable. I wasn't the same anymore because I didn't want to live in the same place as before. He spoke of distance, but he didn't realize he was the one who created the abyss. Deep down, there was no longer room for resentment. There was only the need to turn the page. His betrayal was the trigger, but what I was building now was mine alone. This awareness brought me peace. I no longer sought answers, only continuity. I decided to schedule a final meeting with my lawyer to finalize all the details of the separation. It was the final step to formalize what had already been decided in my heart. There was no fear, only determination. This decision was no longer about him, but about me. On the way home, I felt a strange lightness. The wind blew against my face as if signaling a new beginning. The lump in my throat from other times was gone. What was present was the serenity of someone about to start over somewhere else. I arrived home and found him sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone. I looked at him and realized there was nothing left between us. No pain, no love, just the emptiness of something gone. I took a deep breath and went upstairs, determined not to prolong what was already dead. That night, I silently packed my documents and clothes, packing them into a discreet suitcase. Each folded item was a symbol of closure. There were no tears, only focus. I was ready to take the final step. And it was in that absolute silence, between the weight of the past and the lightness of the future, that I realized the final confrontation wouldn't be just between me and him, but between the woman I was and the woman I decided to be from now on. The morning I decided to leave home, calm washed over me unexpectedly. There were no tears, just a sense that this was the only possible path. Every detail of my experience had led me to this point, and there was no longer room for hesitation. I left a letter on the table, simple, direct, and straightforward. I didn't write to convince, but to end the cycle once and for all. It was a clear record that trust could not be rebuilt. As I zipped up my suitcase, I remembered how many times I'd done this on happy trips. This time the weight wasn't the baggage, but the liberation it symbolized. I was leaving with no fixed destination, but with the certainty that I wouldn't return to the same place. He realized it too late. He called my name, tried to say something, but my decision was already solidified. There was no more room for shallow promises or tears of regret. I walked out the door with firm steps, without looking back. Every meter I walked down the hallway seemed to erase years of submission. The pain gave way to the certainty that I was finally in control. The streets felt different that morning. The wind blew in my face as a reminder that the world was still open to me. It wasn't an end, It was just the beginning of a new version of my life. Close friends sent me messages of support as soon as they heard. Some congratulated me on my courage. Others simply said, "We're here." This hammock was the mattress that prevented me from falling into the void. That day, I realized that many women go through the same reality in silence. How many keep evidence? How many carry suspicions? How many ignore signs? My story was just one of many. As I looked ahead, I asked myself, what if it were you? What would I do? Would you ignore the signs, give in to fear, or choose to start over? These questions kept echoing, asking for answers from anyone who listened to my story. And it was with this thought that I understood. The real betrayal was not just from him to me, but from the society that teaches so many women to remain silent in the face of lies.